Anthony Kaldellis is one of the foremost writers on Eastern Rome, late Eastern Rome, that you'll find writing today. I would recommend everything he's written, including this. This is the only one that I have in paper form, and to me it is the most interesting of what I've read. In this book, Kaldellis is essentially attempting to argue that, contra what Central Western thinkers have to say about it, Byzantium is not actually any kind of theocratic state. In fact, nor is it really even an empire. It is a continuation of thee, right? And now I put these sticky notes in here actually some time ago, and so I may not remember exactly the point that I was attempting to make by marking all of these places, but I'm sure we'll come to it as I open the book and go through. But before we open the book and go through, I wanted to address something, which is the nature of the Republic versus the Empire versus the forms that those two things now take today. So Greece pre-Roman invasion, obviously it was split up into the Hellenistic kingdoms, and before that it was split up into the city-states, And those were they were actually kingdoms, in the sense, except for Athens, famously a democracy. But they were kingdoms in the sense that they had these kind of single autocratic rulers, right, on the one hand, and they had a very personal form of government. When the king prospered, when the king was good, the place would sort of not necessarily prosper, but it would be better if the king were good. It actually mattered, is what I'm saying. And politics were essentially personal. Under a Roman Republican form, politics are impersonal. It doesn't actually matter who any one figure is, so long as a particular position is filled. So in that sense, the Romans are the creators of the modern civil administration that gets used in all of most countries, where, to use an Australian example, it doesn't matter who the AO3 data entry person is for this government department. Their personal qualities are irrelevant, as long as they've got the ability to type applications into the computer fast enough. To use a rather banal example. But you can swap out heads of departments because they're still expected to perform that same civic role, right? It's not that there's anything personal about what they're doing. It's an impersonal civil service. That was the great Roman invention, and the Byzantines, or the Greeks, the Eastern Roman Empire, carried that on and spread it back into Europe and then therefore everywhere else. But it began with the kind of Roman model where, as far as I see it, you can kill an emperor and then just elect somebody from the army, and just continue rolling along with the war machine, right? So you have these two contrasting forms of government, which in my brain I see as the Greek and the Roman. I only see the other one as the Greek, just because that's what, at least ancestrally, I am. And I see the other one as the Roman because I believe that we still live in a kind of Rome. This book is a kind of exploration of that as applied by Enlightenment thinkers, and then by Kaldellis himself looking at the question of what Byzantium is in a more sober way. So he kind of looks at the way that Enlightenment thinkers and that traditionally that academics have considered Eastern Rome. And of course, you have hundreds of years of people like Edward Gibbon shitting on it and saying this is just a theocratic hellscape where everyone has to be orthodox and there's no imagination and there's no, it's all very personal and the emperor has absolute autocratic power and so on. When it's actually true, argues Kaldellis, and I think argues quite correctly and quite intelligently, that the Byzantines continued the Roman Republican system and that they lived in a res publica and that they had that kind of civil service method of doing things where the exact person who fulfilled a role was less important than the fact that the role had to be performed, right? And The great big example of that is the emperor. Kaldellis argues throughout the book, how is it possible that the emperor has absolute ultimate power when he could be rioted against and when he could be deposed and replaced and, have his eyes gouged out and have his eyes burned out and have his nose cut off and all the other brutal, horrible nonsense they used to do to each other. If the emperor had absolute power, obviously there's something wrong there, right? That doesn't really make sense. If he has absolute power, he should never be deposed, and yet they were deposed, famously, they were deposed about every 5 minutes. So rather amusingly, he begins the book by shitting on Enlightenment thinkers, which I enjoy very much, and by the people who kind of blindly follow them. So have a read of this. You can pause here if you like, Move past the horror of the Roman name and the obsession and single-minded focus on Christianity, which is in the modern scholarship. I'll be citing exponents of views with which I disagree. Most of these are so pervasive that they could be illustrated from dozens or hundreds of modern publications. Everyone in the field has had these views at one point or another, and then he says essentially, if I offend you, it's not just you. So he's covering his backside from all the academics, and just saying, look, if I'm citing you, it's not because you've done this thing sort of yourself, but because you're echoing earlier thoughts of the field. And then here we go, Enlightenment. So the identification of Byzantium with a particular type of theocratic order was promoted by Enlightenment thinkers who wanted to use it as a model by which to discuss contemporary problems indirectly. They weren't interested in the truth. Yeah, they were trying to be excessively rationalistic, That's the next green over there. There it is. Focus, thank you. The thinkers of the Enlightenment tended to treat Byzantium as a mirror in which to reflect and abjure those aspects of their own societies they wanted to abolish. Byzantium was a useful political tool, not a scholarly construct. What makes Rousseau useful is that he theorized the Roman Republican tradition, and he doesn't realize that Byzantium is a later phase of that tradition, which is what this whole book is about. Now, there's also a green one up the top here, and I'm not quite sure why it's at the top or what it points to, but let's have a look. Possibly because it started on the previous page, so we can have a read here and see what this is about. Okay, supreme power of the emperor, yes. Exceptions had to be made to the laws, but they could only be made by the judgment of men acting in real time. Law emanated from the emperor. How could he be subject to it? This tension gave rise in Greek theory to the idea of the king as a living or an animate law. Empsychos nomos, a living, walking, speaking source of law. What exactly people meant by that is opaque. Okay, I'm not really sure what that has to do with the Enlightenment thinkers, and so I don't know why I use the green sticky note, but never mind that. I think we will discuss what happened, or what I was thinking when I marked these parts with yellow. The yellow parts from memory are the kind of modern applications of some of these ideas, right? So around this section, Kaldellis is talking about the sort of fiction of the emperor's absolute power and the way that power was actually exercised. And one of those ways was by states of exception, right? Popular actions where the emperor's power is kind of temporarily put on hold, and then the conventional view is, the mobs were rioting, but what's actually happening is not mobs rioting, but people exercising a kind of republican freedom of will, right? Or so he argues anyway. And then where does this point? Oh, this is another modern political point as well here. So power was formally transferred from the Senate and people to the emperor upon the accession. People tend to treat that in the later Roman Empire as a fiction, that transfer of power, because, we have to be clear where the fiction resides. Certainly by this point, the people in the Senate had little choice, so they weren't free assemblies in any modern sense. However, it's likely that our own elections are also fictions in that sense. Ooh, No comment. But essentially, he's making the point that the Roman people have absolute power to decide who the emperor is. And, he goes through much proof and much logic throughout the other pages, but I'll not mark it to save all of our time. Now, I think the blue... Oh, this I reckon should be a yellow as well. So this bit here. People in power are able to act outside the law, and they're almost never brought to justice. Some would argue that these contemporary societies are no longer lawful polities, and they no longer qualify as democracies, republics, or whatever they are. Very true. And quite pointed. But what's this next one? Or is this the next one? They're on opposite sides of the same page. So I think the blue ones are more about the sort of power of the people, and they kind of make these disparate points, A people is a people before giving itself to a king, and then on the next page over we've got popular action is extra-legal, but that doesn't make it illegitimate within this Byzantine system, which is really a republic. It's not an empire. And then we actually go back to this page, and this is another point about perhaps modern elites. It could be applied quite easily. Of course, senior optimates thought the republic was dead because their own freedom of action was curtailed. Doesn't that remind you of democracy dies in darkness? It reminds me of that anyway. And this part too. Focus, please. Thank you. Where even is it? Our elections are not altogether different. Few of us see the fundraisers and the other meet and greets by which the plutocracy decides in advance who the candidates are going to be and who's excluded. These facts of power are not strictly speaking democratic. They violate the spirit of democracy, but they're ratified retroactively by a popular vote in free elections, without which the whole setup would be illegitimate. In Byzantium, as in ancient and modern republics, the people were the ultimate source of political legitimacy, though they regularly ceded choices of personnel to elite groups. Oh, you mean like a republic? And then this is just, I think this is the last one, yes. And then I'm going to talk about something else. This isn't just taking you through random bits of a big book that, and leaving you to kind of piece together stuff I didn't say. I'm going to say something else. But the people, they tended to act as one group. They were rarely split on opposite sides. Minority groups were rarely successful. This was the key to the power, by the way. And this is why I'll leave the rest of that sentence unsaid. I'll let you finish it yourself. Right? They didn't seem to be afraid of the emperor or the imperial government, and it was impossible to appeal their verdict. The elites on which modern scholarship has lavished all of its attention were fully aware of the crucial role that popular interventions could play. Right? So, focus, please. Thank you. So that's what that book's about. And as a sub-theme running through it, it is also about the, as we noticed at the beginning, the kind of Western Enlightenment thinkers having their own go at interpreting what the Greeks are doing, which they very much like to do, which many of you will probably see or have seen already with Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. I don't expect too much from it, but I'm going to see it myself. I guess we'll find out. But I suppose my point in saying all of this is that the Western Europe has been doing this to the Greeks for a very, very long time, taking whatever they're doing and kind of recontextualizing it, repackaging it, trying to overwrite what's really happening with their own idea that they have created for their own ends. And I am beginning to sound a bit like a Greek nationalist, but that's just because the nature of the point compels me to sound that way. And it is true that there have been so many kind of not stolen, but so many Western interpretations of what the Greek people have always been doing, mostly of antiquity, again, Chris Nolan, but then of the Byzantine, the Enlightenment characterization of Eastern Rome as well. And what that has led to is an effective ignoring of 99% of the history of Greece and in the popular mind, in the popular culture, of course, Greece is the country of first, everyone went around wearing togas, and there were Athenians and Spartans who fought each other, and they were all gay. And then question mark, and then it became one of the poorest states in the European Union, and haha, they have to pay their debt to Germany, right? So where the middle go, many Greek people were wondering that themselves, especially after the War of Independence, when the mainland was won, at least, and then all of the academics from the West started pouring in, all of the Brits, all the Germans, all the Russians, right? After the armatoli, the generals, had reclaimed Greece, and they were sort of waiting for Kapodistrias to make the decisions they wanted. And when he didn't, something very terrible happened to him. And then even after that, you had all of these Western academics coming in, and they were starting to do research and dig things up and look for what they wanted to find, which was classical era Greece. They took away all of the Byzantine construction on the Parthenon, because they wanted to restore it to the classical era Athenian appearance. So it's a long-standing point in Greek nationalist polemics, and I think that is a quite important point to make, and it's one that too often gets overlooked. It is actually quite a left-wing point. It's a kind of cultural imperialism or appropriation, where all of the Western dudes came in after the war was won in the 1830s and so and further on after that. And they started picking apart everything that Greece actually was and trying to restore it to this kind of fantasy that they'd only ever learned about in books. That's what this is about. I do highly recommend this. This is an allegorical tale about everything that I've just said, and it's very good. And what it's about is the difference between Hellenism on the one hand and what's called Romiosini on the other. So you can Google that. There's more that can be said about it than I can say. But I just wanted to draw attention to that as a kind of postscript to this, because this is the source of Romiosini, which is, I suppose, translated something like Romanness, the state of being Roman, which, of course, the Greeks thought of themselves in that way. Up until, in some places, in Smyrna particularly, they were thought of as being Roman until 1922, So it's my personal view that Rome didn't cease to exist until 1922, but that's just me being, romantic and foolish. But Romiosini is something that it's the folk tradition of Greece. It's the Orthodox tradition that grew out of here, and that survived through, all the years of Turkic occupation. And then when the English people and the Britain and the French and the Germans and so on came along to look at Greece after it was sort of reopened to the West in that way, although of course they were able to go in before and do whatever they did, but to a lesser degree. They came along and they ignored all of the actual living folk traditions. And they were wandering around going, why isn't everyone here like a Greek philosopher, like I've read about in my books? Why is this guy who I've met on the street just an illiterate peasant who's named Petros instead of a highly literate, Athenian genius named Philoxenos or something? Like, this is nothing like what I expected. They've been doing it to Greece since the donation of Constantine, right? And thank you, Christopher Nolan. I can only assume that such mischaracterization and such claiming of heritage for a country that is essentially unique, it's not really, it's a border country. I expect that, anyway, this state of affairs will continue. But in the meantime, as usual, I urge you to educate yourselves and take a look at both of these, because they're both very good.